Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Contrarian Podcast. And boy, oh boy, this is the now third time I'm attempting to make this video. A few days ago, I had a guest on this show, and by the time we finished recording, we realized the first 20 minutes of their audio had not recorded. So, we had to scrap that one. But we brought up a couple ideas in that conversation, and it was about differentiating between culture and ethnicity. And so there was some very big abstract topics in there that I wanted to explore further, just in a video all on its own. And then when I tried recording yesterday, I had a few mess ups. And then also I did get the video out, but apparently my audio then started cutting out. My microphone decided it did not want to record maybe a few minutes at a time while I was ranting. So, we're here today trying this for a third time, and I really do need to get this message out because it's really important, but also this is probably going to be my most controversial video within this series of sort of deconstructing what's going on within evangelical movements. So, I, of course, need to reiterate that, one, I'm not always right. I make mistakes all the time, so I'm not 100% right in my thinking. And two, test everything for yourself. Hold on to what is good. And, I mean, really, three, I suppose, today. This video is not meant to offend anyone. It is just meant to sort of say what I know. And so if you take offense, understand that that was not the intention behind these things. Because I realize that this conversation can get very difficult because it does say things that are different to the popular opinion. So what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, differentiating between race, ethnicity, and culture. And we're going to talk about it from a biblical perspective, from a history perspective, and so on. And so join with me today as we sort of dive into these three topics alone. And it should be a shorter video today, especially since it's my third time trying it. Okay, so I have to start off with an anecdote, a story. And I'm going to keep the people in this story nameless so as to sort of protect them and their identity in this. Urbana 18 happens at the end of 2018. It is a big Christian conference for mission organizations. It occurs in St. Louis and it happens every 3 years, and InterVarsity puts it on. During this conference, you have thousands of students across the world attending, and you have a group of prayer intercessors that are gathering in a hotel room, usually 24/7, and they are praying for the conference, they're praying for the people there, they're praying for travel, they're praying for all sorts of things. And it's a great idea, especially at any conference, to just give prayer covering to those around. Now, something happened at this conference that was I was made aware of, particularly in this intercession group. So, one group of students, they were Native American students coming from the West, were very delayed coming in because of rain and snow. They were unlikely to get in possibly 2 or 3 days into the conference, and by that time the conference is pretty much over. So they had gathered, and they were praying vigorously for these students. And one person in this group said that in their head came into mind the Thunderbird. And I'll pull up a picture here. So Thunderbird is something from Native American mythology. If I'm going to relate it to anything, I'm going to relate it to Zeus or Thor. These sort of mythological figures. They rule over the upper world and they throw lightning down. The Thunderbird is very much a mythological creature. In a lot of sense, it's a foreign god. Anyway, they said, oh, this image of a Thunderbird came into my mind. So why don't we, I don't know, this is an idea. Let's stand in the formation of a Thunderbird, as a group of intercessors, and let's start praying for these students so that they'll make it to the conference. So, of course, for me, when I'm hearing this, I'm getting very mad. This is... And what's making me the most mad is that it didn't raise any red flags among the people that decided that it would be a great idea to form their bodies into the shape of a foreign god and pray. I mean, that's just blatantly breaking the first 3 commandments right there. You know, there's only one God, worship him alone, make no idols, right, of him or any other god, especially with your bodies, and then don't use his name in vain. You're gravely misrepresenting him, thinking that he would honor something like that. Anyway, of course, you can probably tell I'm a bit frustrated. So they pray. The students, of course, don't get there. And this is something that I need to say illustrates a big, wider point that we're going to talk about today. When do you draw the line when it comes to multiculturalism? Obviously, I think you should start drawing the line at when you're sinning, right? But it's really hard. It's really hard because when you embrace this sort of broader mindset of toleration of these things, then you're going to have a hard time putting the foot down when it's just idolatry, just straight idolatry. Let's move to some scripture today. So, Deuteronomy 7, this is given to Israel, of course. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their sons for your daughters, for they will turn your sons away from me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But thus you shall do to them, you shall tear down their altars, and smash their sacred pillars, and hew down their Asherim, and burn their graven images with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Israel is distinct. They do not worship other gods. They do not intermarry with other nations. And the reason that is because you will be tempted to follow other gods. It is very clear, any sort of idols that they have, you tear it down, you burn it, you just utterly destroy it. You don't try to go and redeem these things, you know. Paul and in Ephesus, they try to go into the temple of Artemis, and they're saying, like, stop worshiping these idols. And of course, it's a big, multi-leveled institution, because not only is the temple of Artemis at Ephesus a bank, it is also a religious center, and it is also a cultural, it's also a political center. You know, people that are proconsuls would rule out of it. So you can't just change them. You just kind of have to completely tear them down and reveal them for what they are, and that's just the idols and false gods which people serve. So there's pretty much zero tolerance for this within God's law. You don't even entertain the idea of it. Why it's so tricky for people that embrace multi-ethnicity is because culture and ethnicity are almost exactly tied together. And the thing is, culture, as it is termed by just people around you, it can be just flagrantly idolatrous. You know, there can be Christians that are idolatrous if they have a certain culture about them. There can be different cultures that, of course, and, you know, just anything. You know, let's just talk about even just the Roman cults. You know, they had all these different Greco-Roman gods that they worshipped. They had emperor worship, all these things. And, that, you know, that's the cultural thing to do. And, like, if you're talking about doing cross-cultural things, you don't really go and say, like, hey, I mean, maybe you should. What you're doing is just, it's abhorrent to God. You can't worship these things. And that is, you know, the gospel in a lot of ways is offensive because it goes to these people and it says, this is not the way to follow God. So we got to really get into our distinct terms and terminologies here when we're talking about race, ethnicity, and culture. So race, by and large, when we're talking about, is a human construct. I even agree with InterVarsity's paper on it. Even the critical race theorists are right when they're talking about race specifically, and that it is a concept that it was made by evil men in the 15 and 1600s, so that they could essentially categorize an entire group of people, like there is the white race and there is the black race, by their skin color, so that they could enslave them. So it was made by greedy Englishmen in the South, so that they could essentially enslave an entire continent of people. And they were evil men, and they basically are using this sort of social Darwinism. You know how animals have different species. They essentially ascribed species to people, and then categorically made laws and institutions so which they could then enslave them. And that is where essentially racism comes from, right? Because you're still working along those categorical lines. Here's just the Wikipedia view of it. Race is a grouping of humans based on shared physical or social qualities into categories generally viewed as distinct by society. The term was first used to refer to speakers of a common language and then to denote national affiliation. By the 17th century, the term began to refer to different physical traits. Modern scholarship regards race as a social construct and identity which is being assigned based on rules made by society. While partially based on physical similarities with groups, race does not have an inherent physical or biological meaning. It's absolutely right. There is no difference in human DNA. My DNA is human. If we get somebody halfway across the globe, also human. Let's look at what InterVarsity says in their paper. Let me pull it up real quick. Even in InterVarsity's racial reconciliation paper, race categorizations of human beings is a historical invention and relatively recent one. And they go and talk about sort of European colonialism, social Darwinism, Darwinian theorem, and it was the justification for slavery. So I definitely agree with them. What I don't agree is, of course, going on with them. So even InterVarsity would say that race is a social construct. But let's look at biblical. We have to really look at what God says about these things. So God does not differentiate between people except in this one way. He differentiates between people, between man and woman. He does not differentiate between people groups. He sort of says that Israel is a holy nation and everyone else is just the nations, right? But he differentiates between man and woman. And if you're following this sort of intersectional narrative, it turns out that the one transient quality people have these days now is your gender identity, and that everything else is sort of fixed in place, particularly your race, your ethnicity. These things are all fixed, and that's what modern intersectionalists would tell you. But biblically, there is the human race, and by and large, that human race is in decay. Evil is the same everywhere, and it's in every human. Sin does not differentiate between skin color. And so what are people talking about when they talk about race? Well, I mean, mostly they're talking about skin color and culture. And those are really the only two differentiating things between people. And the thing is, skin color is just how much melanin you have in your skin. And if you are closer to the equator, you're going to have more melanin in your skin. And then if you're farther north or south from that, you're going to have less. And so your skin color is different. And so if your skin color is different, then suddenly people might start judging you based on just that skin color alone. And that is, of course, racism, right? You know, you're black, I'm white, and I hate you. That is racism. Absolutely. So then really people are the same. You know, there's a brothel in Brazil. There's brothels in East Asia. You know, there is violence in the south of Africa, and there is violence in North Korea. There is just sin and broken people everywhere. So the problem is, of course, sin, and it infects the entire human race. So when we're talking about race, mostly what people are referring to is skin color and culture, right? So now we have to sort of break down these things further. Race is completely a human construct, completely and utterly. And stop using it, because these are terminologies invented by evil men, right? If we're going to categorize people in this way, you are no different than the people that invented it. Now, I get you have to be like anti-racist and other things, that you have to deconstruct these systems that discriminated based on these facts. But when you start using those terms, you become no really different than the people that first used them. That is a harsh take, but I'll just say it. So what are we really talking about? Well, we're really talking about ethnicity then. Ethnicity is a sort of this nation or nation statehood. How InterVarsity would describe it, let's pull that up again. Eastward. Nope. There we go, desktop. Okay. So InterVarsity is not really sure what they talk about when they talk about ethnicity. And it's in fact, my strongest point. Go back a couple days ago and look at my biblical view of ethnicity, and we'll see it. So in InterVarsity, our preference for the term ethnicity or ethnic group is influenced by prominent biblical term nations. We acknowledge that the term ethnicity does not map precisely with the definition of nations, but we believe the biblical portrayal of Israel and nations can be a constructive contribution to this conversation. In the Bible, God views human beings not only individually, but corporately. That's true. They are identified corporately, blessed corporately, and even corporately held responsible. That is also true. Even through successive generations, these corporate identifications can be small, family, tribe, or large people's nation. The Bible indicates or implies the tribal ethnic membership of virtually every character mentioned, and these identifications are portrayed as important. Scripture is clear as God's ultimate redemption of humanity is not in undifferentiated individuals, but as recognizable members of nations. We could, of course, debate that. But so that's InterVarsity's view on ethnicity. And they can't really solidify the term because it doesn't map one for one. Let's pull up the book American Nations. It's a good book. It describes the sort of 11 different cultural nations within America. And it's like this everywhere, right? Let's just look at, it's hard in, no, I should say it's easy in America to really differentiate between people, and it's usually just based on culture, right? Cultural regions. Culture has more to do with geography than almost anything. So in America, of course, we're a melting pot, so cultural differences are much easier to sort of see. But let's go somewhere different. Let's say like Iraq, and then you have Kurds, you have Iraqis, you have Iranians, you have all these different people groups, and they all have similar skin color, right? The only way that you can really see differences in them is based on culture. And American Nations actually describes the sort of different cultural geographic dynamics within America. And so this book by Colin Woodard, I really recommend it to anyone looking at what it means, like nations, specifically in a modern context, because it attempts to identify really the areas of the country in which there are different national almost identities. And they have different political ethos, they have different personal ethos, and it really, the people that of course are in those regions very much behave very similarly. So let's look at what he says in there. So any effort to restore fundamental American values runs into any obstacle. Each of our founding cultures has its own set of cherished principles, and they often contradict with one another. Woodard differentiates between nation and state. A state is a sovereign political entity eligible for membership in the United Nations and inclusion on maps. A nation is a group of people who share or believe they share, very important, a common culture, ethnic origin, language, historical experience, artifacts, and symbols. Some nations are presently stateless. Some control and dominate their own nation state, and some of them are federated in that they are dominated by a single nation. This, Colin Woodard, very, very closely applicable to what the Bible would determine as nations. So again, the nations, the term goy, it's a gimel and a yud, and it really just means a gathering of stakes, right? Basically a gathering of people with essentially a common interest. And, as Colin Woodard would put it, they might share or believe they share common culture, ethnic origin, language, historical experience, artifacts, and symbols. So, very much I've lived in El Norte pretty much my whole life. You could very much describe my culture as Norteño. Even though I am white in skin color, I've lived here for a long time, and I very much understand the pervading culture here. And so, nation or nation state, it's usually of a shared cultural origin. So really, when we're talking about ethnicity, and really when InterVarsity wants to talk about ethnicity, they really just want to talk about culture. And culture is this essentially group behavior, right? And going back to Deuteronomy, that every sort of nation is going to have culture which is flagrantly against God's design. Even InterVarsity would admit to that in the second circle of their racial reconciliation. So it is almost more geographical. It's built around commonalities more than about skin color. El Norte is a great example. In El Norte, there's, of course, Spanish settlers, but there are also a lot of Native Americans. And very much all share a very similar culture, though they might have different nuances and practices between them. So, when we're talking about culture and ethnicity, let me get back. There's another point I need to make about culture, why it's more geographical. Language really can confine you to geographic regions because you can't break out. That's Tower of Babel all over again. You kind of need common ways to communicate with one another. So then culture sort of stays within regions. And even cuisine too. Cuisine is very much tied to culture, and cuisine comes from what you can grow from the land. Here's a great example. The tomato is not native to Italy. In fact, it was brought over by Marco Polo from China. And so Italian cuisine is it's heavily based off the tomato, but the tomato is not a fruit that is native to Italy. And so, but it grew well there. The arid climate of Italy, it allowed it to grow. That's an incredible story of just how cuisine is sort of influenced by what you can sort of grow and where it grows and how much the people there like it, right? And cuisine's a huge part of culture too, right? So when we're talking about culture and ethnicity, I think it's more apt to say that these are transient qualities. That's a very hard take, but ethnicity, nation or nation statehood, it's a transient quality. Biblically, Ruth, Rahab, they all married into Israel. And there's numerous other stories. There's numerous stories of Israel marrying into other nations and then sort of assimilating into them. That's the whole Assyrian captivity. That's the whole Babylonian captivity. That's the whole view of the diaspora, the dispersion of people, is that they sort of get mixed into other nations. So biblically, it's transient. In today's world, it's very transient too. There are people in America that expatriate all the time. There are people that immigrate to America all the time, and they change their national identity in terms of nation statehood, right? Not in terms of ethnicity, what you would want to. I'd say most people would say what you check in a box, right? Caucasian or white or Asian. But, you would come to America and then you're Japanese American or Mexican American. And essentially your nation statehood changes. So it's transient in that way too. You still might have the cultural influences of where you come from. But in terms of nationhood, right, it has, in a lot of ways, changed. Because when people want to talk about ethnicity, they really want to talk about race. And of course, race is this, I would say, concept foreign to the Bible. It is a concept foreign to really what should be on anyone's tongue. And they want to talk about race. But that is not a way to define people. I think that's a bad way to define people. So when people talk about ethnicity, they want to talk about race, but what they're really talking about is culture. And of course, culture is transient too. It is group behavior, and you can change your behavior a lot. Growing up, I grew up and I wanted to run, and then maybe I was a actor, and then I wanted to skateboard, and so I was a skater, and then I was a hipster, and then it keeps going on, and your culture changes because the people you're around change. Your family, changes in a lot of ways. Your friends change, and the people you grow up with and you share common qualities with, it changes. So your culture even changes. And so when people are talking about ethnicity, they're talking about how much or how little you ascribe to sort of the stereotypical views of what that culture would operate like. And so, look, I'm Italian American. I'm not going to really use those identifiers because I don't necessarily agree with them. But like my heritage, of course, is Italian, French, Canadian. It is Irish. Well, let's really look at it. I don't know how to cook like any French food. I don't know how to cook much Italian food. I don't know how to cook much, Wales and Irish food. I don't know any of that. What I can cook a lot of is Mexican food. I can cook a lot of also Asian cuisine too. So these are weird, I'd say transient qualities that people will just try and define an entire group of people with. Because cultures are very different. And I would say InterVarsity is good at teaching what it looks like to cross culture. They've got this cross-cultural diagram, and it's really good because whenever you cross culture, and even in like marriage too, you're going to run into problems and you're going to run into dissonance. And so like, what do you do to move on further? So I think really what we're talking about is we're talking about culture, because when Ivy is talking about ethnicity, they categorize it by race, but they mean it's actually something cultural. And that is something I've seen plenty of within InterVarsity. And so what happens is they want to affirm cultural practices, but they run into trouble when they can't delineate it from idolatry, when they can't essentially say that's sin, when they do not see the problem with praying in the formation of a thunderbird, let's just say. Yeah, it's a lot. And I've had an allegory that really describes this. Let's say there's a city, and there's a king in a city, and he set forth the rules, and he keeps them strictly. And so, people live good and they live prosperous in the city for many, many years. But there are people that break the rules, and they are put to death for it. And that king is just to do it, because they broke his rules. Some people get really upset at this, and they decide, hey, that king is a tyrant, and let's go out and make our own city with different rules except for the ones that we don't like, so we don't get killed. So they go out, they sojourn out, and they settle a new city, and that city has all the rules that are pretty much similar to the other one, except for a few of them which they wanted to break in the sort of sense. They disagreed with the king in those ways. And then that city falls to the same sort of cycle, as they say, well, people get put to death except for a few rules, and then they go out and they make a new city. It just keeps happening. People keep sojourning out further and further and further, and you're like way out in the wasteland at a certain point. And once you're way out in the wasteland at that point, then and just things are just completely degenerated, completely succumb over to evil. You kind of ask yourself, like, what happened? Where did we go wrong? And so what you might do is you might say, oh, we have to reform this city way out in the wasteland. We have to reform the things that are going on in there. We have to make them right and good. That is almost completely counterintuitive to what you actually should do. And what you actually should do is just return to that original city. You are not going to change evil people. Only God can do that, right? The thing is that when we're talking about these sort of fences, I suppose, what's acceptable, what's not, you become a Pharisee. And the further you get out from the city, you become more like somebody that is going to put little fences around what God has said so that it suits your own desires. And you're going to disregard some of God's laws so it suits your own desires as well. Really, just go back to Deuteronomy 7. The thing you have to do is you are a holy people. You are completely set apart from the nations. You are chosen for his own possession out of all peoples on the face of the earth. So, the thing is, do not be like the other nations. That's a harsh teaching. And let me tell you, Jesus has a lot of harsh teachings. But this harsh teaching is that your ethnicity, your culture, in a large part, do not matter. I will say it here. Ethnicity does not matter. Not really in the slightest when it comes to the grand scheme of things. Because your culture, God has only really ordained one human culture, and that is the law he gave to Israel. He has said this is the way to live. This is the tree of life. This is the path to the tree of life. There's really only one culture you can adhere to, and everything else, in a certain way, is going to become idolatrous in some form of another. But you have to be holy. You have to be separated. You have to be kadosh goy. You have to be ethnos hagios. These things mean a lot. Jesus' call to follow him means that you give up your whole life to follow him. Anyone who would follow me, pick up his own execution stake. It's hard words. Let the dead bury their own dead. He who does not hate his father and mother has no part of me. These are really hard words when it comes to following Jesus. So, how much are you willing to give up when you come to follow him? Are you willing to give up your cultural practices, whatever they may be? Are you willing to come into his nation? Hard questions. But I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining me today. This was a hard conversation to have. If you could, I would really like it if you liked, subscribe to this video. And if you shared it with people around you, that would be greatly appreciated. I'm probably going to make a lot of enemies with stuff like this. But I am completely ready for it because I'm really ready to stand on the truth and the principles that God has provided. So, finding people that really might have their minds changed by this video, that would be really helpful if you wanted to share it with them. Other than that, I think I'll leave it here. May Abba bless you and keep you, and shalom to you all. Stay safe. Amen.